Alright, so now, what do we have coming up? So we have a few more sessions, actually we have about 6 more sessions planned. So the first up we're going to have is Peter Elst, one of the most well-known Flash Flex developers around the world. He's going to talk to you about using the SQLite database with Adobe Air. And then we have a bunch of other sessions. I think up after that is Andrew Shorten, one of the platform evangelists based over here in Europe. He's going to talk about enterprise applications and data-intensive apps with Air. So let's go ahead and get started. Please welcome Peter Elst.
Thank you, Mike. So, good afternoon, Brussels. It's good to be home. I've been traveling for 3 days. Now, an introduction to SQLite and Adobe Air. Now, you have to realize that it's not easy to talk sexy things and databases, so I'll try to make it interesting. I've made some new demos since Amsterdam, just to spice it up a little bit. But the first few slides are going to be theory, a little bit of SQL, but I'll try to have you survive it. So, why SQLite and Adobe Air? Well, a number of reasons. First of all, it's an embedded SQL database right in the runtime. You're not dealing with an external server, you don't need to set up anything. It's zero configuration, it's just one single file. And now one of the things that's very interesting about SQLite is that it embeds this SQL92 standard, which basically means it does anything you do, for example, with PHP and MySQL, except for a few exceptions like foreign keys. That's not implemented in SQLite yet. But apart from that, it's very lightweight. It's embedded in the runtime. You don't need to install anything, just to reiterate that. And every single database is just one file. Remember that throughout the demos. It's very easy to port these databases across systems, synchronize it with an online resource or whatever. You can all do that with SQLite. So how do you use it? Well, it's easy. 5 steps. I'll walk you through it. The first one is creating a file reference. Now, you've all seen the file API today. We've looked at how to create and read files. Well, you use that exact same API to create a file in the file system. And the file is then used to link to a SQL connection class. That SQL connection class is basically the database you'll be using. It binds that database to the single file, and then using flash.data.SQL statement, you actually run queries on that file. Then the third step is simply opening that database connection, then linking it up to your SQL statement and specifying what query you want to run. And then finally you just execute it and you've got your data. Now, this doesn't mean much, this is just text, but what I'm going to show you now is how simple it is to actually have a database up and running with just a few lines of code. So, the first few lines you'll see here is importing the file API. Flash.filesystem.file is the basic class you use to create files. Then you have flash.data.star. That has those 2 classes that you need, the SQL connection and the SQL statement class. Now, first step I talked about creating that file that you use for your database. So you say db file is a file. We'll store it in the application storage directory. Now that's a unique folder on your file system for every Air application that you've got. So you can ensure that there are no other files in that specific folder. So in this case, we're storing something called contacts.db inside that folder. And then we instantiate those 2 classes, a SQL connection class for the database and a SQL statement class to execute something on that database. Now, SQL connection opens up this database and we pass the file reference as an argument. Now in this case we're using a synchronous API. I'll show you later how we can do it asynchronously, which is a better solution in many ways. So when we've got the database open, we do the SQL statement and we say the SQL connection you're going to use, the database you're going to use is this reference. So SQL.com, we pass to the SQL statement and we say select star from contact. So in this case we're assuming there's a contacts table and we want to return some rows from it. And then simply execute that statement. And on the very next line, when you're using synchronous API, you'll get the result back as an array when you call the SQL statement or the getResults data property. So that's it. In this few lines of code, you've got a select statement, you've got your database set up, and you've got it all running locally with Adobe Air. Now, I talked about synchronous and asynchronous. In the last example, we had a synchronous call, and that looks like the code you see here. Now the problem with synchronous is that it locks up your application until you get results back. So that's not a very good thing for the user. You might have some very large insert statements or whatever, and it takes a while for those results to come back or to get an event back. So your application is basically useless during that time. So anytime you're using anything more than just creating a table or just selecting a few queries, use the asynchronous API, which uses events and event listeners. So it's very easy, very similar to the other snippet of code I showed you. Well, we set up two event listeners in this case. SQL result event.result, which returns the result for your query, and SQL result event.error, which returns the error. Now, one difference you'll see here is rather than calling the open function, you call open async, which means that you're now using the asynchronous API and will dispatch those events for you to use and have listeners for. So the two classes I'll briefly mention. The SQL connection class does basically three tasks. It connects to your database file, it provides those events if you want to use it asynchronously, and it allows you to have access to the schema, which we'll show later in this talk. Now the SQL statement class does all the query work for you. You pass it to the database connection and it executes that for you. It also provides event for asynchronous use, and it supports something called result page, which is very interesting, the way it's implemented in SQLite, and you'll see that as well. So we'll move on to what type of data you can store in a SQLite database. Well, these are the basic types. I've explained them, and they're ActionScript3 equivalent. So you've got a null value, basically null, and the ActionScript equivalent is null with a lowercase letter. You've got an integer, which is a signed integer, and it corresponds to a new data type in ActionScript3 called int, with a lowercase letter as well. And you've got real, which is a floating point number, and it corresponds to number. And text is interesting. That's a string, but it's UTF-16 encoded, so that's just something to know. And finally, blob, I particularly use for storing binary data, for example. You'll see that in one of the examples as well. So that's just a blob of data in your database. Now, SQL statement has something very interesting when you want to make sure you're not suffering from the risk of SQL injection, which is a risk you run when you use a string concatenation in your SQL queries. Now, what you do to bypass this is basically using attributes. So you can use an @ sign or a colon sign, and in this little snippet of code you'll see select star from contacts, where ID is attribute ID. Now that attribute ID is of course not the ID we want to pass to that query, but you'll see in the SQL statement of parameters that we're replacing that by some other variable. And as soon as you execute the statement, it will automatically make sure that it's hooked into that query and everything runs as expected. Now you see that those parameters are name-based in the above example, but you could just as well use index-based.